you're giving us consent to go ahead and record. Cameras aren't enabled and mics aren't enabled, so we won't be taking any of your information, but we are going to be recording and posting this up after the session's done. So again, chat, for anybody who isn't familiar with Teams, is along the top nav bar there, right beside there's two little people, and then there's a chat bubble. So click on that, and then you can see the chat box will fall down, and you can kind of keep up with what's happening there, questions that are being asked, comments, all of those kinds of things. Now, if you have technical difficulties for any reason, go ahead and log off and try logging back on. We had a couple of people last time that just had problems joining. There are quite a few people joining, so sometimes it takes a bit to get everything stabilized out. If you're having additional trouble, I suggest just turning your computer off and on and get coming in that way. That's worked for me in the past. So to get familiar with using the chat, maybe we'll just go ahead. Some of you are acknowledging what treaty territory you're from. We'll do that in just a minute here from SaskPower, but go ahead and introduce yourself. And we'd love to know why you decided to join us tonight. What was it about SMRs in Saskatchewan that kind of piqued your interest, or what did you want to know more about? So go ahead and put that in the chat if you would. And I don't know, Tonya, if you're still letting people in, don't worry about putting the slides up. I'll just go ahead and do the land acknowledgement without the slides. So I'm here in Regina, which is on Treaty 4 territory, home of the Treaty 4 nations, and also the homeland of the Métis. And we always acknowledge that the land we're on at SaskPower in the spirit of Indigenous reconciliation. If anybody wants to share where they're joining from, please go ahead and put that in the chat if you'd like. Just going to give everybody a moment to kind of get settled in, because we'd love to hear some, or see, I guess, in the chat, some information from our guests about why they're joining tonight. Awesome. We've got Jerome from Yorkton. So you can go on to the safety moment. So just, as we get started here, I just want to take a moment and acknowledge that, at SaskPower, safety is part of everything we do. We want our employees to be safe, and we want our customers to be safe. And developing that strong safety program like we have at SaskPower involves providing opportunities for people to have what we'll call, I guess, safe conversations, to call things out if they think that something's going on that shouldn't be going on, or even to support something if it's maybe not the most the favorite thing of others. So providing those safe spaces for conversation is a part of our safety program, and it's a really integral part of a nuclear safety program, so in the nuclear industry. So we thought we could roll those two things together tonight and talk about the fact that we really want tonight to be an open conversation. We know people have differing perspectives on nuclear power, and we're going to be talking about, the future of electricity in Saskatchewan that involves not just nuclear power, but other options as well. So there's lots of different perspectives on that. And with everything going on in our world today, we just want to make sure that as we gather here tonight, share perspectives, we need your questions, we need your input, but just do it respectfully. So we thank you for that. I'm just seeing some of the answers in the chat. Learn more about SaskPower's journey to examine this source and its place in the energy mix. Got folks from all over Saskatchewan. That's awesome. So there's going to be a lot of opportunities for conversations about nuclear power and the other options SaskPower is looking at as we work to get to net zero. And to help us with these conversations, we've invited some guests to join us, at least here tonight. They won't necessarily be delivering presentations, although we hope they come back and We could do a panel discussion with them at some point. So as I introduce them, I'll just ask them to maybe turn their camera on and give us a wave. We have people from Saskatchewan on our SMR project, and we also have people from across the nuclear industry in Canada. So we have Alex and Rick from New Brunswick Power. New Brunswick gets about, I think, 40% of its electricity from nuclear power. Is that right, Alex and Rick? We have Cameron from Ontario Power Generation. We'll refer to Ontario Power Generation a lot as OPG. Ontario gets about 60% of its electricity from nuclear power. Hey, Cameron. And both of those provinces are moving forward with SMR projects as well. We have Sarah and Ryan joining us from the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission. That's the nuclear regulator, so they're responsible for overseeing all activities, nuclear activities in Canada. That's mining, that's medicine, that's research, and nuclear power. And we have Paul from the Nuclear Waste Management Organization, the NWMO. The NWMO is responsible for the safe long-term storage of Canada's used nuclear fuel, finding a site for that, a permanent site for storing that. So it's been really important for us at SAS Power to work not only with Saskatchewan's existing nuclear industry, but also to get to know others from across Canada over the past, 6, 7, 8 years, so that we can use that information to help us inform our project here. So I just want to thank everybody for participating tonight. You'll see those that I introduced, they're going to help us answer questions in the chat. We might call them out verbally and have them answer some questions on the breaks. But overall, they're just going to support the information that we have. So thanks for that. You can go on to the next couple of slides, Tonya, the agenda slide. So, sorry, the agenda slide, just back one. So my last little bit of housekeeping is, this is what we're going to talk about tonight. First of all, some context. Why is SAS Power looking at nuclear power, and why are we doing it now? And then we've broken down the rest of the presentation into the kinds of the questions that we get from people. A lot of people feel that SAS Power should be only looking at wind and solar, or that we should only be looking at bringing in hydro from outside of Saskatchewan, or that we should be really focusing on storage. So Ian Harry is going to talk all about that tonight, about we need all of those options to help us get to net zero. We're going to have our project manager, Darcy, talk about what even is an SMR and how does it work? How might it operate? There's Darcy, sorry. What about the waste, the nuclear power waste? And I know Ian will talk about, some of the other, we have waste from coal as well. How is waste in this particular industry stored and managed? We'll go over our project schedule, some key milestones, things that you're going to see coming up. And then more importantly, we want to make sure that we leave time to answer your questions. So in the chat, absolutely. And then if we have time, like I said, we'll take a break in between some of the content sections and answer some of those verbally as well to give a more fuller answer. So we want to learn what's important to you, and we're going to invite your feedback and input. If we can't get to all of that today, we have feedback forms to send out. We'll have many, many more conversations about this. We have a public consultation email address that we'd love if you reach out to contact us. We've got some more information about that later on. But I'm going to now put up our first poll. So I'd love it if you could tell us in this poll where in Saskatchewan you're joining from today. You don't need to tell us your name. The reason we ask this question, and it is anonymous, is because as we share information about this project, we want to make sure that we're hitting, broad across the province, that we're reaching people all over the province. So when you tell us where you're joining from, that helps us know we need to do a better job of reaching certain areas that maybe we're not seeing show up although it's early in the project right now, we want to make sure that we're sharing information as broadly as possible. So thanks. Oh, I think in the poll, do you have the poll up, Tonya?
Yep, it is on screen right now.
Oh, sorry, I see the poll slide, I just don't see the poll itself.
Oh, it should be on screen. We've got some people who are registering
cool.
where they're from.
Okay, I've got a lot of chat, but I don't see it in the poll, so okay, that's good.
We'll give it a few more seconds.
Okay. So as we are waiting for the poll question to populate, I'm going to take a moment and just introduce Ian Harry. Ian is a senior business advisor here at SaskPower in the area responsible for planning the future power system. He worked on the solar task force here at SaskPower. He worked on the SMR feasibility study before he joined SaskPower and then at SaskPower, and now he's leading this project. So he is going to tell us a little bit, set some context to start tonight's presentation about why SaskPower is looking at nuclear power and why now. But before Ian starts, I just want to see the results of the poll. Yeah, I'm not seeing the slide. I see a few people saying they're not seeing the poll, but that's okay.
We have had several respondents,
awesome.
However, that are popping up here. So,
okay.
so it could be an issue with just connections there.
Yeah. Tokyo? Does that say Tokyo? Interesting. Thanks, everybody. Appreciate you taking the time to share that. So if you want to just move to the next slide, we'll hand it over to Ian and let him get started sharing some information about why we're looking at nuclear power and why now. And you can just go right to the next one, Tonya.
Great, thanks, Leanne, and good evening, everybody. It's my pleasure to be sharing some time with you tonight. We really appreciate you taking the time from your schedules to get to give us the opportunity to talk a little bit more about nuclear power and why SaskPower is advancing with the development of nuclear power in our province. Leanne started by posing a number of questions, and I'm hoping that we will cover all those questions off. I want to throw a few more onto the list, and I see some of these have already come up in the chat. So that's because they always come up, and I want to make sure that we cover them off because I know that people are interested. A couple of the things that we hear when we go to have conversations about nuclear power with people across Saskatchewan, all over the province. Some of the things that we hear consistently that I hope we'll be able to address effectively tonight. One is that building nuclear power plants takes too long, and we have to act now to address climate change. And so we'll talk a little bit about the time frame for nuclear power and its role in our long-term plan to reduce the emissions from our power generation fleet. Another one we get is nuclear power is expensive and solar and wind are cheap. So why don't you just do more solar and don't do nuclear? Or an alternative would be, why build solar when we have all that great wind and all that great, why build nuclear when we have all that great solar and wind? And we'll talk a little bit about that. And one question that we get always is, what about the waste? What about the waste products that come from generating nuclear power, the long-term waste, the used fuel, the medium-term waste, and the short and the high-level, medium, and low-level waste? So we'll talk about all of that, and I hope by the end of the evening you'll feel like you got your questions answered. And we have a lot of people that will try to answer the questions that you have in the chat as we go along. And as I think Leanne made a mention, there'll be places in our talk where we pause and see if we can answer some of those that are coming up in the chat. So why nuclear and why now? Saskatchewan has been looking at nuclear power for a long time, since the early 1970s. It's always been a pretty promising generation option, lots of power, very little waste, no emissions. And so many times over the last five decades, we've had a pretty close look at whether we could deploy nuclear power in our province, as has been the case in New Brunswick and Ontario and many, many states in the United States. And the answer, pretty short answer is, it always fell short because we could burn coal and gas to generate electricity at very low cost. So that's reliable, low cost energy. We have lots of coal, it's mine mouth coal, lots of access to natural gas. As long as we have those fossil fuels to generate power with, nuclear power is not going to be an option for us. But climate change is driving the need to urgently reduce GHG emissions in Canada and in Saskatchewan. And as we eliminate our coal and our natural gas, we need to look at new baseload generation, reliable, dispatchable electricity. And that's a pretty short list, and nuclear is on it. So then large reactors, all of the reactors in Canada and the United States, commercial scale reactors are large scale reactors. The CANDU reactors are in a 600 to 700 megawatt range, a little bit bigger than that, some of them. Large units are too big for Saskatchewan. We have a very large province, but we have a small grid. We have just under 5,000 megawatts of generation capacity. We have a peak load 3,700 megawatts. 1,000 megawatts in one spot in one generating unit is very difficult for us to manage and integrate. So big ones are too big for Saskatchewan. You'll hear Darcy talk about small modular reactors, and we think reactors in the 50 to 300 megawatt range are just about right for Saskatchewan, and that's what we're focused on looking at. Everything we do at SaskPower is driven by the need to address our emissions, but equally so, the need to ensure that we provide reliable, competitively priced power to our customers. So our motivation for looking at all the generation options is exactly that, to provide zero emissions, reliable electricity at a competitive price to our customers. We need to phase out our conventional coal. I'll talk a little bit about why we think we're going to have to phase out our natural gas generation in the medium term. And so that's what I hope to cover off between Darcy and myself and all of our guests from the nuclear industry by the end of the evening. All right, next slide, please. So to speak to why are we looking at nuclear, why don't we just build solar and wind? And the real simple answer is that we don't really have a choice. We don't have the choice of choosing between which option we're going to develop and which ones we aren't. The regulations that apply to SaskPower's emissions will require us to retire our coal fleet by 2030, and the federal government is now considering regulations that would require us to achieve net zero from the power grid by 2035. That means we have to retire 100%, virtually 100% of our baseload electricity generation capacity in Saskatchewan over the next 13 and a half years. And that means that we have to look at all of the available options. And that's what we're doing. Some of you will be familiar with geothermal. We're working with a company called Deep out of Saskatoon to develop geothermal generation. We're just in the process of commissioning our first biomass plant in the northwest part of our province. We are developing our first large-scale energy storage project near Regina. We continue to deploy wind and solar, and we will continue to do that right through 2030 and beyond. Saskatchewan has some of the best wind and solar in Canada, and we need to get as much wind and much solar as we can reliably get onto the grid. And we will certainly be pursuing that as we have been for the last number of years. And of course, between now and 2030, 2035, we have access to natural gas. We also have existing hydro in Saskatchewan, and we import hydro from Manitoba, and we also import clean energy from other jurisdictions. And everybody's familiar with our carbon capture project at Boundary Dam, which was one of the world's first and largest commercial scale carbon capture projects. So all of those are on the table, and we're going to need clean energy from all of them that are available. After 2030, things change a little bit. No more coal. After 2035, 2040 potentially, no more natural gas. And in a world that has none of that fossil fuel in it, which is how we get to net zero, which is what we need to do to address climate change, it's more wind and solar, and we're pretty enthusiastic about the potential for energy storage to come down in price. And as it does come down in price, and as the technology allows us to access the energy storage capacity that we need to expand our wind and solar and turn it into a firm energy product, we will advance and take advantage of the wind and solar that we have in Saskatchewan. So wind and solar with energy storage, it's going to be a really important part of our energy future. Hydrogen production is something that everybody in the world is looking at. We are certainly interested in that in Saskatchewan. Hydrogen production as a transportation fuel, zero emissions transportation fuel. Hydrogen production to use in the production of electricity. And we think that there's promise there. We're very early on in the hydrogen economy, but we will continue to work with other utilities, with the Government of Canada, and with our research community to understand the potential for hydrogen. And nuclear power from small modular reactors, which is what we're going to focus in on today. So I hope what I've left you with is a view of all of the above. As President Obama said a few years ago, we need a clean energy strategy that includes all of the above. And in Saskatchewan, we're no different. We need to make sure that we're looking at all of the available options, and we're doing that. We need them all to get to that objective of net zero emissions. Next slide, please. So specifically with regard to nuclear power from small modular reactors, this is a slide of SaskPower's emissions, the CO2 emissions that come from our generation fleet. On the top left-hand corner, what you see is our emissions today. This year in 2021, SaskPower is going to emit about we're going to emit about 14 million tons of carbon dioxide as a result of our coal and natural gas-fired power generation. Over the next 8.5 years, we are going to cut those emissions by 50%, at least 50%, and probably more than 50%, down to about 7 million tons per year. And we're going to do that by retiring 100% of our conventional coal and adding more wind and solar to the grid. We also expect to add more geothermal, and we expect our customers to add more clean energy as well. We will also add more power imported from other jurisdictions, potentially Manitoba, potentially the United States. And that will help us to get to that 50% reduction from 2005 levels by 2030 of CO2. So we will get to 2030 and we'll be at zero megawatts of coal-fired power generation. But we will, so that's good. That's the good news. The challenge for us is that we will be at 50% of our generation capacity coming from natural gas, and we'll get a lot more than 50% of our electricity from natural gas. And if we continue to rely on natural gas, you see that blue line is our emissions, and they flatten right out and stay at about 50% of 2005 levels right out to 2050. That's the challenge. We don't think it's a sustainable long-term supply strategy, and that's why we're looking at all of the available non-emitting generation options. One of the things that I see in the chat, and we often get asked about it, is why not just build wind and solar? Why worry about the other stuff? And the answer is because we need, SaskPower has 520,000 customers, of which about 150 buy 70% of our power. What that means is we have a very high minimum load, and we need a lot of baseload electricity that's always on, that we can rely on and that we can dispatch. And that reliable baseload dispatchable electricity, today that comes from coal and natural gas. If we want to get rid of coal and natural gas, we have to add more reliable baseload electricity. And the two most obvious and highest potential sources for that are hydro, either imported hydro or imported clean energy from other jurisdictions, or nuclear power from small modular reactors. And so that's what's driving our interest in more hydro, more imported power, and the potential to deploy nuclear. If we start to look at those options and rely less on natural gas, you get the green line of emissions, which reaches net zero by 2050 and avoids a lot of emissions, 74 million tons minimum, that we would have emitted getting to the same net zero goal if we relied on natural gas out to the end of 2049 and then shut the last remaining units down. So the potential for us to deploy a diversified energy mix that includes nuclear, hydro, and wind and solar, biomass, geothermal, imported power, gets us to net zero by 2050. And we may have to actually achieve that objective 15 years earlier than that in 2035. So we need all the options available, and we need to look at all of them right now. So that when we think about nuclear and to answer the question, why are we looking at nuclear? That's the reason why.
Awesome.
Next slide, please.
I think before
okay.
before we put up the poll, Ian, I wanted to call out just one question. There's a couple questions, and I know we get these questions all the time. So I just wanted to make sure that we address so everybody understood. So there's a question or comment in the chat about batteries might make SMRs completely uneconomical. Iron air cells could get us down to $20 a kilowatt. That's US dollars. And he said he knows that this is not proven yet, but it has some really big backers, and wonders if SaskPower is looking at this kind of option with the same kind of resources, he says, as nuclear.
Well, we're looking at all of the available options, including energy storage, not just chemical storage from batteries, which is what a lot of people think about when they think about energy storage. We think about energy storage in the form of a hydro contract or an import contract. We think about compressed air energy storage, all sorts of different ways of storing energy, and all have great promise, I think, for Saskatchewan. We're really interested in understanding the economics of storage, and we fully expect the cost of energy storage, large scale, utility scale energy storage, to come down significantly. I agree with the comment that's made that there are a lot of really smart people and a lot of very well financed research happening with regard to energy storage, and I think we're going to be successful in driving down cost and making it a great way to regulate wind and solar, and so that in the medium term, moving into the 2030s and into the 2040s, I think we're going to see a lot more wind and solar on the grid, because it will, as those energy storage options become available to us and become economic. But if our energy requirements require more than just that. We can't just rely on one or two options. We have to rely on all of the options that are available. So we don't have the luxury of picking and choosing. We are very fortunate that we have such an awesome wind and solar resource, and we are pretty confident that as over the next decade, next 15 years, we're going to see the cost of energy storage come down to the point where it's going to be a competitive option for our customers. And as that happens, we will certainly be deploying it to the benefit of our province.
Awesome. And just two other quick ones I've heard you answer before. So there's a question about, the need. We know that many industries are moving towards electrification, and what SaskPower is doing, right? This is all kind of part of our plans to decarbonize, to make sure that we're ready to support the electrification of industries. There was a question about that as well. You can add to that.
Yeah, it's a really exciting time to be in the utilities business. The plan in Canada, I think it's fair to say in most jurisdictions in the world, is to as quickly as we can move away from fossil fuel for energy. And it's not going to happen overnight. I mean, we're going to sell the world will consume 100 million barrels of oil this year and 100 million next year, and it's going to start to go down, but there's going to be a lot of oil consumed in the world before there's zero oil consumed in the world. So it's not going to happen overnight. But if we want to move those industries currently reliant on fossil energy, if we want to move those industries to net zero, a big part of that is going to be electrification. And in order for that to make a contribution to addressing climate change, we have to achieve a zero emissions grid, and that's why the government of Canada, I think, is starting to look at, could we achieve a zero emissions grid by 2035 or 2040, before 2050? And so for Saskatchewan to do that is an enormous challenge. and one that we think SMRs have great promise to address. We also need to build transmission lines so that we can bring imported energy in from other jurisdictions, and we need and that will also support more wind and solar. So once again, it comes back, it's kind of like every question leads to the same answer. We need to find ways to deploy zero emissions energy from all of the available sources so that we can accelerate the time frame for getting to net zero, because we need to urgently address the challenge of climate change. And that's what we're motivated by in our evaluation of nuclear power from SMRs. Somebody asked about the resources that are being used to evaluate SMRs. We have a team at SAS Power that is focused on evaluating all of the generation options. So we look at the potential for more wind and solar, geothermal biomass. We have people that are planning transmission to bring in more imported clean energy. We have people looking at carbon capture on coal plants, and we have people looking at nuclear power from SMRs. So it's part of our it's part of the operation. It's part of what we do every day, we think it's money well spent as we move towards that zero emissions energy future that I think we all agree is urgently required.
Good, thanks, Ian. There's a couple of questions that I think I'm going to invite our guests in the chat to answer. There are a couple of questions about some of the SMR projects that are going on in Canada. Maybe New Brunswick Power or OPG might want to address those questions in the chat. And there's a couple of questions about health impacts around existing nuclear operations. So if I invite our colleagues from OPG or New Brunswick Power to answer those as well. And Ingrid, I see your question about the time it takes to build. We'll absolutely be talking about that. Our project schedule and milestones is a big part of our presentation that we'll share later today. And we're also looking at, we'll talk a little bit also about some of our the work we're doing on distributed energy and net metering and opportunities to participate in that as well. So,
hey, Leanne, can I jump in there for 1 second? I just had a chance to have a quick look at the questions, and I wanted to just answer one of them because I think it's a great question. And someone makes the point that this slide that we have in front of us, it's a slide that measures GHG emissions. But the question was whether our estimate of the future demand for electricity takes into consideration the requirements of electrification. And the answer is no. This slide does not take that into consideration, I think, as much as it should, or I don't think it reflects what is going to happen to the demand for electricity. We're working through that. We have a whole team of people that do nothing but focus on the long-term demand for electricity. Obviously, it's an important thing for SAS Power to understand as we plan our system. But I think the point to make there is that we are going to need a lot of clean energy, and we're going to need a lot more because we have to get rid of almost 100% of our baseload generation that serves our load today, coming from coal and gas. So no. I don't think this is a fair representation of what will happen to the demand for electricity as we really start to move other industries to electrify and reduce their emissions. And that's another really good reason to look at intense sources of electricity generation like hydro and like nuclear.
When you go ahead and put up the poll, so you've heard Ian talk about, what SAS Power is doing to achieve net zero emissions. And I've been around SAS Power for a long time, so we've asked this question at various stages. So I'm going to introduce it again. How important is it to you personally that SAS Power achieves net zero emissions from the power system? Is it very important? Is it somewhat important? Or is it not important at all? Just go ahead. I can see the poll up now. If you could go ahead and answer that, that'd be great.
Deanne, I think you asked OPG or New Brunswick Power to talk a little bit about the companies we're working with and some of the plans? Is that
Yeah,
correct?
there were a couple of questions, Rick, about SMRs maybe not being a real option for SAS Power or some of the other utilities that it's too far away. So maybe if you could take a couple minutes and just share some of the work that you're doing on the advanced reactors in New Brunswick, or maybe OPG wants to talk a little bit about the Darlington new nuclear project. We're working really closely as a group of utilities to make sure that we kind of map this out together, but I invite you to either one to go ahead and share a little bit about that.
Yes, I'll start, and then I'll turn it over to Ontario Power Generation. So we do have a pan-Canadian approach for this. So, working as a country on small modular reactors. We looked at several different companies and chose two to work with, and Moltex Canada is one of the companies, and ARC Canada. And right now, ARC are working on a design of a 100 megawatt small modular reactor. The plans, the high level plans right now, is to have the first of a kind built on the Point Lepreau Peninsula, where we have a CANDU 6 running right now, in the early 2030s. So currently they're doing starting preliminary design work. They've just completing conceptual design. The ARC is modeled off a research reactor that was in the United States. So there is some proven runtime on the technology. And so, we still have much work to do with our federal regulator, many licenses to apply for and have them go in front of the commission for decision. And so currently we're looking at a license to prepare site, which would be putting some roads in and clearing some land and applying for that in 2023. Once we do that, that would kick off an environmental assessment, which would take several years. And so that's sort of some of the timelines. And I see Cameron's on camera, so I'll turn it over to Cameron to say a few words.
Great, thanks, Rick. So Ontario Power Generation's has looked at a number of different developers. We narrowed it down to a short list of 3 with General Electric, Hitachi, Terrestrial Energy, as well as X Energy. The final decision is expected to be made soon. It's with our board of directors as well as our provincial cabinet. So we're all waiting with bated breath as to which developer will be selected. Where we're at in the process is that we have our site license for preparation. Environmental assessment is complete. Next year, we're moving ahead with our license to construct application. That'll be followed by 2 to 3 years of consultation with the CNSC as part of reviews, and that will also include public hearings as we move forward. Our target for completion of the construction and commissioning of the new reactor is 2028. We're also working on a micro modular reactor up at Chalk River. This will be a 15 megawatt thermal plant or 5 megawatt electrical output plant. It's a test reactor essentially that potentially could be deployed in more rural areas and certainly off-grid applications. And we're looking at having that in service by 2026. Our whole approach with the small modular reactors is has to be a strong business case, that there's a requirement for electricity, and that it is a cost-effective approach for us. And that's where certainly we're expecting quite a bit to work with the first of a kind, as Rick mentioned, and then for subsequent construction after that, we'll definitely benefit from the first go around. A lot of industry cooperation between SAS Power, OPG, New Brunswick Power, and we're learning a lot from that, plus paying pretty close attention to what's going on globally. As to some of the other questions in the chat with regards to I would say environmental monitoring around our plants and our waste storage, there are some very stringent requirements that we have to follow and want to follow as part of our various licenses. That environmental surveillance, we have submissions that go to the regulator on a quarterly basis. There's annual reviews, and the regulator monitors this very, very closely. That also includes health effect studies in the area of our plants. And these have been ongoing for decades in each of the areas. And we take this extremely serious. One of the key reasons that we want to be a very safe and effective industry is to ensure that the public around our plants are just as safe as those employees that are working at the plants as well. So we have, when we looked at, even with our nuclear waste storage, there are certainly aspects that we have to monitor it, but we have different categories for the waste. And some of our low-level waste doesn't stay radioactive for extended period of time, and we're also able to go through and decontaminate and clean up the waste as part of our ongoing activities. But certainly pretty excited for the next steps in the nuclear industry, and thanks for your chance to comment. Back to you, Leanne.
Great, thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, Cameron. And we appreciate all the questions that are coming in the chat. And if we can't get to you right away, we definitely will do our best to do that, or call them out verbally, or answer them in the chat, or follow up after the session. I'm now going to introduce Darcy Holderness, who is our project manager. Darcy's managed a number of large infrastructure projects for SaskPower, and played a key role in the carbon capture and storage project down in Estevan. And he's going to help us understand how nuclear power works and talk about an SMR, how an SMR works, and the SMR technology, and a little bit more about our project. So thanks, Darcy.
Yeah, thanks, Leanne. So we'll try to run through some basics on how nuclear power works and what these SMRs are. And we've got a lot of information following about where we're at in our project timeline, and what are the key requirements for this technology being an option in Saskatchewan, and how we're leaning on our utility partners, those from OPG and New Brunswick Power that you heard of, and the extensive nuclear industry that exists today in Eastern Canada. It's really important for us out west, when we're considering new technology like this, that we have those partnerships in place, and including the nuclear regulator, the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission. They've grown up with the industry out east, and it's little known to a lot of people out west, the extensiveness of that industry out east. But anyway, we can go on to the next slide here. So this is a very simple schematic, and it's based on the CANDU reactor technology. We borrowed this from New Brunswick Power, but there's a few concepts that are important to understand here. And so what you're seeing here is just a very high-level overview of a nuclear power plant. So the reactor shown there is where the nuclear fission happens. That's where you're extracting the thermal energy out of a nuclear reaction. And so you've got some form of fuel in there with some form of cooling, a cooling system to remove that heat. And that heat is then removed and converted into steam. Some reactors are direct contact with the steam cycle. Some use an intermediate kind of medium to transfer that heat. But all of these type of power plants produce steam. And once you produce the steam, that steam runs in a closed cycle with a turbine and a generator to produce electricity. And so that aspect of the whole facility we're very familiar with here. It's the same way our other thermal power plants work, be it coal-fired or natural gas, combined cycle natural gas, that is. And so the other aspect you see on here is once you've taken all the energy you can out of the steam cycle, you need to cool the rest of that last bit of energy out, and you condense the steam into water, and that lets you pump it and re-energize it and move it back through the closed system. So you need a cooling source to remove that final amount of low-grade heat that finishes that cycle. And so it gives you an idea. Lots of the SMR technologies operate in different ways, and the way they get the energy from the nuclear fission into that steam cycle is different for lots of different reactors. And that's a lot of part of the evaluation process when you're looking at these technologies. But the same basic principles are there. So we can move on. Yeah, so this is a picture. It's Ontario Power Generation's Darlington nuclear power plant. It's a 4-reactor unit, and it produces a total of 3,500 megawatts. So on most days, this one power plant could power our entire province out east. It's located just outside of Toronto. I think there's 6 million people that live within 100 kilometers of this facility, and it sits right on the shore of Lake Ontario. The Pickering nuclear power plant is just inside this one, a bit closer to Toronto. And this is based on the CANDU reactor technology. Again, it's not well known in Western Canada, but that type of reactor is a Canadian design. It was developed in Canada, and it's been exported around the world. There's CANDU reactors operating in many different other continents around the world. And so it's bred a very strong nuclear industry out east, and it's allowed for us to have one of the globally well-respected nuclear regulators through the CNSC. They're very well respected on the national stage. And so these type of partnerships, we really look to leverage as we evaluate this option for decarbonizing and getting us off fossil fuels out west. We can go on here. So SMRs, a little bit kind of about what they are. So conventional reactors including the CANDU reactors are in that large kind of category. So they're greater than 700 megawatts. Typically it's 800 to 1,000 megawatts per reactor. And that type of technology is just too much for us in Saskatchewan. If you have one single unit producing that much power for a province our size, if you ever lose it, you need to have some backup in place pretty immediately, or you'd have a large sweeping outage. And so it doesn't make economic sense to incorporate any power plants that size into grids in our market. And so the small aspect of the SMR really speaks to the amount of electrical output per reactor. And that's typically, we define that or the industry defines that as 50 to 300 megawatts electric output. And that 300 megawatts is about the same size as our larger size coal units in Saskatchewan. It's the same size as our new combined cycle gas facilities. And so it just makes sense for us. The micro size reactors are, as the very small reactors that you heard Cameron from OPG talk a little bit about, are in the less than 50 megawatt range. And they serve a different purpose, more in the kind of off-grid remote communities or remote mining operation, that type of situation. The modular, it means that you try design the reactor and a lot of the components to be built in a shop environment. And that really takes a lot of the risk in terms of your field work out of the picture, out of the equation. So the cost and schedule overruns that are an issue with these super construction projects and large conventional nuclear are a little bit more manageable for these SMRs. The reactor, it's a nuclear process. We get the thermal energy out of a nuclear fission process. And so that's kind of what that represents. These SMRs, so you kind of got a little bit of a perception of the size of the facility through that last slide at Darlington. The developers that we're evaluating suggest that you can fit one of these SMRs at the 300 megawatt size in a 15 to 35 acre footprint. We're likely thinking it's going to be a little bit more than that, and we'd probably look for a quarter section for the first project. But that's about the size that you're talking about. And the safety case, I think our next slide speaks to this, but these SMRs, and we can advance, Tonya. These SMRs are, it's the slide after this, I guess, but they represent a increase or an evolution in the nuclear industry. So the safety case and the environmental stewardship that comes with SMRs, even compared to conventional reactors, it's a next level. It's a real advancement in the industry. So this is a quote from John Gorman, who's the president of the Canadian Nuclear Association in Canada. It's interesting. John, he has a really interesting story, and if you get a chance to hear from him, you should. He comes from the renewable industry. See, he spent 20 years working in the renewable industry in Canada, and he was a big part of those costs coming down, and he saw projects ramping up. So mass deployment of renewables as those costs came down, and similar to what we're doing in Saskatchewan right now with renewables. But you aren't seeing the needle move too much in terms of emissions levels, and emissions intensities haven't gone down. And so he looked to the nuclear industry to make that adjustment. He's very passionate in that area, and so he's transitioned over into the and now he's the president of the Canadian Nuclear Association. But he compares SMRs are to large reactors like desktops are today to what mainframe computers were in the 1980s. So it just gives you a feel about the stewardship and the safety case associated with this technology. It doesn't compare our coal plants. Most of them were built in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and I've spent my career at SaskPower cleaning them up and separating water streams to lessen their impact on the environment. And so it's really not like what we've seen before, and that's an important concept to remember, I think. But if we go back to that last slide, Tonya. So there's three streams. Canada has a national approach to evaluating this technology, and there's three streams that are being developed as we look at it and look to deploy it here. And so stream one is near-term on-grid applications. So these are our size, SaskPower size. The 300 megawatt kind of range is what these are, and they're looking at deploying these in Canada by the end of this decade, by the end of the 2020s. And so OPG, Ontario Power Generation, is leading the way in this area, and they're developing that project at Darlington that you heard a little bit about, which could be connected to the grid by the end of the 2020s. There's 3 reactors that are being evaluated there. GE Hitachi has a boiling water reactor, X Energy has a high temperature gas cooled reactor, and then Terrestrial Energy is a molten salt reactor. These are 3 very different reactors. They come with different opportunities and different risks, and so it's important that we evaluate those closely when we look at this. But we're working very closely with OPG as they use their nuclear experience and expertise to evaluate the technology readiness, the risk levels of each of these, and they're looking to make a selection by the end of this calendar year, within the next month. And then SaskPower will decide if we can align with OPG and deploy the same technology in Saskatchewan as they're going to at Darlington. So that's stream 1. Stream 2 has 2 reactor technologies that are being looked at in Canada, and this is being led by New Brunswick Power. They're a little bit more advanced reactors, and they're a little bit later in the deployment schedule. So these would be more in the 2030s. There's 2 reactors, but they come with some advanced benefits as well. The Moltex reactor, for example, it repurposes used CANDU fuel to get some more energy out of it, so you can get more energy out of the used nuclear fuel from existing CANDU reactors in Canada. Stream 3 are 2 they're very small reactors, so in the less than 50 megawatt range. Both of these are about 5 megawatt electric output. There's two technologies that are being considered in Canada. The Global First Power is the one you heard from OPG. That's at Chalk River, and they're looking at deploying around 2026 or maybe a little bit later. Excuse me. Westinghouse also has a very interesting design with a small reactor. They call it a nuclear battery. And you know that SaskPower isn't looking at these reactors because their main business case is kind of remote off-grid communities or off-grid industrial applications. But they do have some other benefits and some other options for near-grid or on-grid industrial applications. Or maybe we can use them at the end of the outskirts of our grid in Saskatchewan to help with reliability issues, which is a problem in some northern communities. And so those types of applications could be considered out west for this type of reactor as well. If we can skip to ahead now, Tonya. So small modular reactors, but they still are mega construction projects. So the construction phase for this type of project would be measured in the multiple billions of dollars. They have low operating costs for a long time after that and a very high reliability, but there is construction risk associated with building this supply option. Now, with that construction phase comes a lot of significant impact to Saskatchewan as well. So and that impact can be measured in GDP for the province. And so some of these numbers shown on here are the types of jobs and taxes that would come to the province associated with building this technology. And that's all outside of the clean electricity that we would look to get as a utility, SaskPower. And that might help. We're going to lose industry and economy when we shut down conventional coal in Saskatchewan, and that's coming at the end of the 2020s by 2030. And so this option may help to offset some of those losses. And as we look to phase out natural gas after that, this helps to reduce our reliance in that area too. Support aggressive deployment of wind and solar. So there's been a lot in the chat about renewables, and we don't view SMRs as competing with renewables at all, not today. And so aggressive deployment of renewables is an important part of any pathway to net zero. And we would look at how SMRs can integrate with that kind of future power system. So some of the technologies have energy storage built into them. You can store the energy as opposed to outputting it and then release it when the renewables aren't available. Or you can maybe divert that energy into hydrogen production or other things like that to use as storage. SMRs, they do have some ability to move up and down in load. They're better suited in that sense than conventional nuclear, but they're not nearly as flexible as a natural gas-fired unit, which is what we use today to back up renewables. Next slide. So key requirements. We've done a lot of work in feasibility, and these just summarizes some of the key requirements that we need to have in place to successfully deploy this type of option in Saskatchewan. The first three really speak to utility partnerships and a pan-Canadian approach to looking at this technology. So we have to leverage the experience we have in Canada and the nuclear industry that we have to de-risk it, to help evaluate and deploy it in a safe and sustainable and with an environmental stewardship in mind in Saskatchewan. And so those partnerships are really important to us out west as we consider this type of technology. First of a kind demonstration. So part of what feasibility for us here is that somebody else has demonstrated the technology first. So they've de-risked it from a new technology aspect. As a greenfield jurisdiction for nuclear power, if we were to take new technology risk on, it would just be a little bit too much risk for us. So we're really looking for demonstration of the technology in another jurisdiction before we make a construction decision here. Indigenous participation is very important for this project, and we're looking to get as much participation in the project as we can. It's a huge opportunity. When you're bringing new technology, you're really bringing new industry to us in Western Canada with this, and that represents an opportunity for Indigenous participation in many different aspects of the project, and we've identified that as a key requirement. Federal risk sharing. So as we invest in any new technology, we look to the federal government to help us with that risk. So funding throughout the planning phase as we develop the supply option is important. But ultimately, it comes down to a competitive price for power. And so we're not looking to deploy SMRs if it's going to increase rates in Saskatchewan beyond what other options might be available for the net zero conversation. And that's That's probably the number one criteria as we evaluate this option. Is it competitively priced with other options that are available out there? So I think that was it, Tonya, is for my portion for now.
Yeah, thanks so much, Darcy. There's some really, really good conversation going on in the chat. And I just want to thank our colleagues from Ontario Power Generation and New Brunswick Power, and also the nuclear regulator for helping us answer these questions. Really important questions and really good responses. What about the used nuclear fuel and waste? I do want to keep going just because we're about 10 minutes over time. So, and I know that used nuclear fuel and nuclear waste is a question that we get from just about everybody, and it's a really important part of a nuclear power project. So I'm going to invite Ian back to talk a little bit about this process, how used nuclear fuel is safely managed and through the process, through the life cycle of a nuclear power project. And then if we have time, we'll also invite the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission and Ontario Power Generation to jump in and New Brunswick Power to add to what Ian is going to talk about here. So thanks, Ian.
Great, thanks, Leanne. Yeah, I'm gonna very quickly just make a few comments and then rely on our colleagues who work with the regulation and management of used fuel and other waste products every day, both in terms of the generation of waste products from today's reactors and also planning for how do we manage the long-term waste from nuclear power plants, which is to say used nuclear fuel in the long term. Next slide, please. So there's not as many questions as I thought in the chat, but there's lots of questions as I kind of started out with when we first started our conversation about what do you do with the waste? What about the waste? Is it dangerous? Last for a long time? There's lots of interest and concern about used fuel and other waste products from power generation. So I wanted to just take a couple of minutes and talk about what kinds of waste are we talking about. When you generate nuclear power, one of the great things about nuclear power, one of the reasons why we're looking at it, is that you get a tremendous amount of energy from a very small amount of fuel. And that fuel comes from mines in Saskatchewan. Uranium is really energy dense. And nuclear fuel, which is the base product of nuclear, we make nuclear fuel from uranium, and in Saskatchewan's nuclear power plants will be 100% uranium from Saskatchewan. That uranium is really energy intense, far more energy from the same amount of uranium compared to coal or gas or any other energy product. So you make a lot of power with very little waste. That's the good part. The challenging part is that the used fuel, when it comes out of the reactor, has to be very carefully managed. And we have been doing that in Canada for 5 or 6 decades. Stellar safety record of managing sustainably and safely managing the used fuel from our reactor fleet in Canada for a long time, in Ontario, in New Brunswick, and in Quebec. And so when most people talk about nuclear waste, what they're thinking about is high-level waste, which is the used fuel that comes out of the reactors. And I'll come back to that in a second. But there's other waste as well, low-level and intermediate-level wastes. The low-level wastes are related to the equipment and that you use when you're working in a nuclear power plant. You can see some examples on your screen there, what we're talking about. That is often don't have to take care of it for as long, and we have very effective processes in Canada for managing low-level waste products from nuclear power generation. And intermediate-level wastes need more careful and more long-term management. The stuff that the components from a reactor, the resins, the filters that come from power generators are also sustainably managed in Canada in the medium and the long term. And the long-term waste, the used fuel, when it comes out of the reactor, in the case of Canada's heavy water reactors, the CANDU fleet, it's cooled in cooling pools until it's cool enough to be put into dry cask storage. Next slide, please. And then it's stored on site at the plants where it was produced until Canada has a long-term solution for that high-level fuel. And this is a picture of the used fuel from some of the from one of the nuclear power plants in Ontario. This is fuel that is managed by Ontario Power Generation. The used fuel is in those storage containers. They're specially designed to contain it, specially designed to make sure that no radiation is released. You can see that there's 3 or 4 people there having a conversation, and they are in no danger whatsoever. This is how Canada's used nuclear fuel is stored today. It's stored on site at the power plants in this kind of very sophisticated containment, which safely stores it with no release of radioactive material to the atmosphere. And in the long term, the Nuclear Waste Management Organization, which is an organization established by Canadian legislation by the producers of this waste, the nuclear utilities that generate electricity from nuclear power. And that organization is developing a long-term waste management facility, which will be located somewhere in Ontario. The decision hasn't been made yet where that will be. And I understand that the objective is to have that facility ready to receive its first deliveries of used fuel in the early 2040s. So in the long term, these used fuel will be carefully and safely and sustainably managed in long-term deep geological repositories in Ontario. So maybe I'll just stop there and ask our colleagues from the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission, the Nuclear Waste Management Organization, to talk a little bit about their role in managing Canada's nuclear waste.
Thanks very much. It's an exciting job here because we get to respond to questions in the chat and also respond them verbally. So thanks very much for everyone's engagement. It's great to see people here posing questions and for us to be able to share information. So the CNSC, so the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission, is responsible for all nuclear activities in Canada. And so that includes, obviously, nuclear fuel, used nuclear fuel. And so the licensee, so in this case, in this picture here, we see Ontario Power Generation. They're the ones who are responsible for safety, responsible to ensure the workers are trained, that they have the right materials, that they have the space, that they have the abilities and the capacity to be able to deal with the waste. Our responsibility and what we're powered to do is to ensure that they're following all the rules. And so the CNSC has created significant regulations and rules and standards with regards to the safe storage of nuclear waste. And so our CNSC inspectors, who are located across the country and are located at nearby these waste management facilities, conduct regular inspections to verify that the waste is secure and is safe. And our international colleagues also conduct a tremendous number of inspections to, again, verify that this waste is being stored safely. So nuclear waste can be stored safely for a very long time in these storage containers before they find their ultimate home and destination. And the group that's responsible for that is the Nuclear Waste Management Organization. So I'll pass it over to Paul, who will give you an outline of where they are in their licensing process.
Thank you. So yeah, just a couple of remarks. I think Ian's already given kind of the thumbnail summary here, but we were created in response to federal legislation that said nuclear used electricity providers should be responsible for managing the waste. So they got together and created our organization. We're a nonprofit organization funded out of the users of electricity, but we have oversight from the federal government and ultimately from the licensing through the nuclear regulator. The plan is to build a deep geologic repository for the nuclear fuel waste. This builds on lessons from nature, which is already storing uranium or radioactive material for billions of years in northern Saskatchewan, for example. We'll add into that with additional engineered barriers. The timing on this, well, it's a I should go back a step. When you're first created in early 2000s, we actually went through a process of talking to Canadians about what we should do with the used fuel. We just had an open book and said, what should we do? And there were a couple of ideas that came out of that. One is whatever we did had to be safe and secure. And the other one was a strong sense to people that we should do something now, that this generation should do something rather than waiting for the future for something else to come along. And out of that, we selected the Deep Geologic Repository, which is also what other countries with nuclear programs are also planning for their nuclear waste. Broadly speaking, the waste will go in a series of engineered and natural barriers deep underground, something on the order of 500 to 800 meters underground, in a stable site. We're currently evaluating 2 potential sites in Ontario, and the process of checking the sites, going through the licensing process, and constructing the repository will take about 20 years or so. So as Lena was saying, we would potentially start operating around the year in the 2040s. We would keep the repository open for a period on the order of a century, current plans, and at that time there'd be a decision about whether we would close it or continue to monitor it. That's in a nutshell, and I can respond to other questions.
I think you did a really good job of summarizing that. Thank you so much. Just for the sake of time, let's just move on to the next section. This is the last section of our presentation, and then we'll leave it open for answering as many questions as we can. So Darcy, tell us a bit more about the project, the planning phase, and where we're at.
Yeah, for sure. Thanks, Leanne. So the planning phase we're going, if we go to skip to the next slide here, it's an overview of the timeline for, this is our timeline we're working to for realistic deployment of this type of technology here. And so if you notice on the bottom, it's about a 15-year timeline that we're looking at here. And we're just starting, we've just hit this first milestone, number 1, and we've got authorization from our board this spring to start the planning phase. And so the planning phase, if you look at the list on the left, there's a whole bunch of work we need to do, and we'll summarize that shortly here, but we think it's going to take roughly 8 years, maybe a little bit more, to get through the planning phase. And that's all the work we need to do to make a construction decision in Saskatchewan on whether to proceed with building one of these facilities here or not. And that construction phase would then take 4 or 5 more years, and we'd be in operation after that. And so if we start getting into it here, so one of the first 2 things we're going to need to do as we get into this planning phase are to evaluate sites and to evaluate technologies. And so we're working very closely with OPG in that Stream 1 category to evaluate technologies. Now, OPG is looking to make a decision this calendar year, as I mentioned earlier, and then SaskPower would look to make our decision on whether we can align with that technology choice or not. And we're looking to do that in 2022, and that's milestone number 2 on here. And at the same time, in parallel, we're doing a lot of work on site evaluation. We do have a little bit more information to share a little bit where we're at on that, but we hope to have the entire province narrowed down to a single site by the end of 2023. And so if we click once more here, Tonya, so that allows us to start the federal environmental impact, federal and provincial, environmental impact processes. And this is new legislation that came out in 2019 from the federal government. And it takes roughly 5 years once you have a site to go through the impact assessment and have a decision on whether you can develop that site with that project. And so that process we've laid out here. This could take a little bit longer, or there's a little bit afloat in some areas of that process, but we'd look to have that done by 2029. And this would also include our first license from the CNSC. So the site impact assessment and the license to prepare a site would be received around the 2029 timeframe, and then we could make a construction decision after that. There are 2 other licenses that we'll need to get. Tanya, you can click a couple more times. That's the construction license and the operating license. And so those will need to follow once we have a license to prepare the site. And those would follow just after, like shown here. And so we click once more. That would then allow us to make that construction decision. And so all you're seeing there is a construction decision, likely not until 2029 for this supply option. And so up until then, we're doing all of this work to find a site, find a technology, go through the regulatory process leading up to that construction decision. And we're evaluating the business case and the business model in this time as well. So what is the cost of power from this supply option? Come 8 years from now, we will know that very as accurately as we can. And that will enable that decision. What are the options on the table at that time? We can make the comparison and make a very educated decision on the best choice to achieve net zero in Saskatchewan. And so one other thing, if you click once more, Tonya, the engagement. So we have engagement planned for this project, unlike anything we're kind of used to as a company or as in the province here. We're going to be very, very open as we move through the supply option and evaluate everything there is to evaluate with a nuclear power project in Saskatchewan. And all of the aspects that we're starting to understand and evaluate, we're starting to share that information even tonight. And so the engagement and the Indigenous engagement is going to be huge as we move through this planning phase. And so if we click once more, the last thing we'll note on here is the OPG's Darlington New Nuclear Project. That is that first potential Stream 1 SMR in Canada. They're looking to be in service around the end of the 2020s. So not only is it equally important that we move along our timeline to enable this supply option in this time frame, which is 2034 connection to the grid. It's equally important that OPG advances with their first mover project. And we need to see that construction phase completed and a reactor in operation in Ontario before we make a construction decision in Saskatchewan. And that really de-risks what is the actual price tag? Are the operating models, the estimates, do they materialize as planned? That type of thing. And so it de-risks the new technology aspect for us here. This is our timeline though, so this is realistic, but it takes a while. So it's 2034 is likely the earliest date we could have connection to the grid from a nuclear power plant in Saskatchewan. Next slide. So siting. Siting is a very important part of the process, and it's an important part of what we're doing early to enable this type of timeline. So we need to find that potential first site. What we've been doing to date, we just started this planning phase, but we've been working to assemble a lot of the technical criteria this year. So what are the requirements of the machine? What are the regulatory requirements when you're siting a nuclear power plant? What are the utility requirements? So where do we regionally need the power and where do we have infrastructure to move the power around? That makes a significant difference on the cost. So those type of factors we can kind of assemble and put together and understand. And the next big step that's going to be part of the process is that feedback. So the understanding Indigenous knowledge and public and community feedback is coming. We're going to be initiating a process early in 2022 to obtain that feedback. So we'll be starting to harvest Indigenous knowledge, if you will, in regions that may be technically preferred, and talking to communities. If you're in a community that may be technically ideal for this type of technology, what are the concerns from your perspective, and how should we factor that into the process? And so that feedback and input as we kind of move our engagement program ahead on the supply option is incredibly important to us. And so we're looking in early 2022, hopefully in the first half sometime, we'll start that process of gathering and obtaining that really critical feedback.
Good, thanks.
I think that's it. Yeah.
There were a couple of really good questions in the chat that I wanted to take some time to call out. One of them was, and you were talking earlier about the technology, and somebody asked a question about the passive safety in the technology. Like, help us understand that a little bit more. The technologies that we're looking at for our SMR project, what passive safety means. And I'm going to just add one more thing to that. Somebody mentioned what happened when the tsunami hit the coast of Japan and caused the accident, the meltdown at Fukushima Daiichi. And I know there are some passive safety features in SMRs that would prevent that kind of thing from happening. So that's kind of where the question was leading to, I think.
Yeah, the safety case for this type of supply option in nuclear power in Saskatchewan is unlike anything I've ever seen. I've spent my career in mostly in our fossil industry. I mean, I've spent a lot of time out at the Centennial Wind Farm in Swift Current, building that facility, and a little bit of time with our hydro, but mostly fossil. So I'm relatively new to the nuclear space, but passive safety really speaks to kind of the walk-awayness of this type of technology, and it's a lot of what SMRs represent in terms of an evolution of the nuclear industry. So a lot of the developers will advertise a walk-away safe design, so no human intervention required in order to maintain that level of safety between potential accidents with a nuclear reactor. And those accidents are what has happened at Fukushima and Chernobyl and 3 Mile Island. Those accidents have happened, and this is an evolution of the technology. If Ian is still on, he kind of explains the difference of Fukushima and how SMRs might work a little bit better as well.
Yeah,
for some of our partners from up east as well.
Yeah, no, I think you did a good job there, Darcy. I get my only contribution to that answer would be that, and maybe I'll do it by answering a question I saw in the chat about when Darcy was talking about why are we or maybe it was me. We're not looking at big units. We're looking at small units because big ones don't fit our grid. They just don't make sense for Saskatchewan for a lot of technical reasons. But SMRs, the size that Darcy talked about, 350 megawatts to 300 megawatts per generating unit, are really pretty well suited to Saskatchewan's power grid. It's not a matter of Fukushima. I mean, I think I'm not going to go into all the reasons why Fukushima happened, but it was caused by a massive tidal wave, and the safety features built into that Generation 2 reactor technology were not sufficient to stop that accident from happening. The reactor designs that we are looking at today, first of all, the reaction of the nuclear industry to Fukushima was to review, and maybe the CNSC folks can talk a little bit about this, but every major nuclear regulator in the world looked at Fukushima and said, okay, we're going to look at all of our nuclear power plants and with a view to ensuring that we learn from it and take steps to make sure that kind of an accident can't happen again. Obviously, in Saskatchewan, we're not in danger of being hit by a massive tidal wave. There are lots of other things that could happen in Saskatchewan, though. We're experiencing in British Columbia one of the big risks, overland flooding. There's lots of things that could happen to a nuclear power plant in Saskatchewan. The SMRs that we're looking at are designed with inherent and passive safety features, which make the challenges that we've had in a very few instances around the world over the last 50 years difficult to imagine could happen again. Now, it's and it's one of the reasons that we like the advanced reactor designs. They are designed such that no human intervention is required, no extra power is required to shut them off and cool them down safely in the event of any kind of an accident. The fuel, in particular with the advanced reactors, is designed to be highly, very difficult from the perspective of nuclear proliferation. There was a question in the chat about that. And the long-term management of those advanced fuels is also being taken into consideration by regulators as we look to long-term solutions. So our primary focus with regard to nuclear power and all of the other power we generate is safety. Safety of our customers, safety of our province, safety of our employees. And in the case of nuclear, the safety is highly regulated, and Canada has a stellar 7-decade record of safe, sustainable nuclear operations, safe, sustainable management of used fuel and other waste products. And so I think Canadians and people in Saskatchewan have every reason to believe that the way we manage our nuclear fleets in Canada today will continue in the future, and that we will only advance nuclear projects if we can build them and operate them safely and sustainably now and for 7 generations to come.
Thanks, Ian. There was a question about cost that I promised I would call out. A couple people have asked how we are going to manage, nuclear projects. Sometimes any big project runs into delays and cost overruns. And so I probably, Darcy, as our project manager, this would fall to you. How we're going to be managing that, how we're going to be evaluating cost or considering cost, how that factors into our decision, and how we'll be managing that as we move through the planning phase of the project.
Yeah, it's a very important part of management of this type of project is risk, and even early risk now, but construction phase cost and schedule risk, and schedule means cost when it comes to construction, is very important. Well, there's a few things. I mentioned the modular aspect of these designs. So any current design of any big energy project, like our new combined cycle gas turbines, the goal is to modularize the design, so to say, and you move as much of that field work into a shop environment. And the shop environment is much more controlled. You're controlled, your productivity levels and things like that are much more manageable. So it de-risks a lot of that aspect of the build. And so we're looking to take advantage of that as much as we can on this type of design as well. The other thing is leveraging a first mover project. So once you see a project hits the operational point, they've proved out the supply chain. You've got all your suppliers in place to build and meet a schedule that has been assembled. And they've proven out all of the aspects of how all of those components are going to come together and get built under a certain model with a certain price tag. And so we really, through those two aspects, the construction phase risk can be managed, but it's a very important part of what we're doing.
Thanks. I know we're at almost at time, and I want to make sure
can I just add one more thing to that, because I think cost is next to safety. Cost is obviously the most important aspect of any generation option that we consider. Darcy identified the conditions that we think are going to be required for successful deployment of nuclear power, and the number one, if you just acknowledge that safety is the most important criteria for any power generation project that SaskPower undertakes. It's no different for nuclear than it is for gas or solar or hydro or any other project. We are focused on safety in everything that we do, and nuclear power is no different. But if we can't deploy nuclear power if the cost of electricity from nuclear power plants, and in this case we're looking at small modular reactor technology, if we can't get the power from those plants at a price that's competitive with the alternatives, then we won't build them. So if we get to 2029 and we've done all of our homework and we say, okay, this is what we think the cost of electricity from a generation portfolio that includes nuclear, along with wind and solar and geothermal and biomass and hydro, and energy imports and everything else that we can get that's zero emissions, if that generation fleet that includes nuclear is more expensive as far as the power that comes from it than generation fleets that don't include nuclear, then we'll build the ones that don't include nuclear. It's pretty straightforward. And so that's how we factor in cost. If it turns out that the cost of electricity from nuclear power plants means that the cost of power to our customers is significantly inflated compared to the alternatives, and it's not one alternative, as I keep on saying, it's generation portfolios that include nuclear and generation portfolios that don't include nuclear, because we're going to need a whole lot more than nuclear, a whole lot more than just wind and solar, a whole lot more than just imported power. That's how we evaluate the cost, and that's how we're going to address the issues of, is it too expensive? So today in 2021, we can't say with great confidence whether it'll be expensive, cheap, or somewhere in the middle. We think there's pretty compelling argument that you could get the power at a competitive price compared to the alternatives available to Saskatchewan in the early 2030s. But we need to do a lot more work before we can definitively answer that question. And one of the ways that we're going to assess that question is to look at the experience that Ontario has, to look at the experience that New Brunswick has, to look at the first SMR deployments, the nuclear power deployments using SMR technology in Washington State, in Wyoming, and in other places in the United States, and say, how did those projects go? How much did they cost? What's the price of electricity from those projects? And we'll use all that to inform a decision as to whether we advance in Saskatchewan. So cost is at the top of the priority list, along with safety. And we are going to do a lot of work to really challenge that question of is it economic power compared to the alternatives? So I hope that for the folks, and there's quite a few of them, and they're saying they're concerned about the cost of power. I think we all are. That's how we're going to address the cost of power with regard to nuclear power from small modular reactors as we advance through our planning phase over the next 8 years.
Thanks a lot, Ian. I want to kind of directly address Michael's question. He's asked again about geothermal, and I just want to reinforce, Michael, that geothermal is, very much part of our plan. Right now, we have a contract with DEEP. Darcy, you can probably talk to this better than I can, but the work that we're doing with DEEP and the capacity for geothermal at this point. There was a question earlier about geothermal maybe being able to power, half of the province, and just maybe touch on that a bit for Michael specifically, because I think he's asked that a couple times.
Yeah, sure. Like through the work we've done with the CO2 capture down in Estevan, we have an aquastore well where we dispose of the CO2, whatever we can't sell, into that aquastore well, and it's into the same formation that DEEP is drilling into for their project, which is just close. It's 25 kilometers outside of Estevan, and so it's 3.4 kilometers below the surface, very, very low down, very deep, and that project is demonstration of that type of process. So they're going to pull that liquid up from that below, 3.5 kilometers down, and take the energy out of that water and then return it back. And they think they're going to get, I think it's 20 to 30 megawatts from that demonstration project. But it is just that, it's a demonstration project. So it will prove out with the cost models for that option. And if it works, then it will be a possible option that we could expand at a somewhat larger scale. It may not be the total option. I think our storyline here, if anyone hasn't heard that, is none of these options are going to be the one answer for our energy needs here. We need everything on the table when it comes to net zero. That's the absolute bottom line. So geothermal, yes. Renewables, yes. Once storage comes into place, once storage is more commercially viable at our scale, battery storage or other means of storage, yes, we need it. Imports, we're going to need to import clean electricity for a while here. More hydro, we're looking at more hydro. There's not a lot left, but we're looking at more hydro here. And nuclear power is another thing. Nuclear power is an option too. So our challenge to get from where we are today to net zero is significant. and we need everything here. So it's really important that we keep our options open, and that's what we're doing with this project, among several others, right?
Thanks. Thanks so much, Darcy. Before you go, Ian, definitely get back to you. I just want to close out for the folks because we are at 7:35. So Tonya, if you could just move forward. Thanks to everybody who participated in the poll. I just wanted to let people know that, we need your feedback. We really appreciate the comments and questions that were in the chat today. So many different perspectives. That's why we're here, is to share this information at this early stage and learn more about what you want to know more about so that we can come back to the table and have those really informed conversations. We are going to be sending out a feedback form as well. And yes, I will send out the polls because apparently some people couldn't participate in the polls. So we'll make sure that you get a chance to have your voice in that as well. In the feedback survey, which will only take about 4 or 5 minutes to complete, we're looking for information about, the siting process. What's important to you? What do you want us to be considering in addition to the things that Darcy talked about? And most importantly, how you want to exchange information with us. This is one way, right? And it's extremely limited. We'll be probably having more virtual information sessions, but also we look forward to meeting with you in person. And then next slide, Tonya. We're also, go back to the one that talks about that join the conversation, pardon me. That link in there, we can throw it into the chat. That is our project page on saskpower.com. We also have an SMR e-newsletter you can sign up for. If you go to that page, you can find all of that information and stay up to date on the project with us. We're also going to be doing some work, asking for some feedback and input on our net metering program and how we're building distributed energy into our power system, and also getting a better understanding of how a power grid works. So those are just a few of the things that are coming up at SaskPower. So I wanted to say thank you very much for everybody for coming. And sorry, Ian, I know you have some good information to share, so back over to you.
No, that was all really good. I just wanted to mention that with regard to geothermal, SaskPower has been a supporter of the deep geothermal project from the beginning. We cost shared the feasibility study with Natural Resources Canada, and we've signed a power purchase agreement with Deep. So that will be the first utility scale geothermal project to be developed in Canada, and so we're all in on geothermal. We're anxiously awaiting the results of that demo project. As Darcy said, it could be 20 or 30 megawatts. It could be 200 or 300 megawatts. It's not 3,000 or 4,000 megawatts, and that's what we need. So it's going to be part of the puzzle. It's not the whole puzzle. We're lucky that we have that as an option in Saskatchewan. Lots of places don't. And the reason we didn't talk very much about it is because our focus today was on nuclear. But we are available to chat about any of the work that we do, any of the projects that we develop. And we will be engaging on this project for a long time. So there'll be lots of opportunities to raise your concerns and ask your questions and provide your input and feedback as we move through this multi-year process of planning to inform a construction decision that we're not going to make for another 8.5 years.
Thanks a lot. Thanks, Ian. You can move forward, Tonya, to the closing slide. So I think there's just some links we put in to the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission. This is where you can get more information about nuclear operations in general, how it's regulated. The Impact Assessment Agency of Canada, we're going to be going through that full impact assessment that Darcy and Ian were talking about. To make sure that we're managing this project properly. It's a rigorous process, but we're really excited to get that work started. The Nuclear Waste Management Organization that Paul was representing today. Also a next step where they're looking at how the different levels of radioactive waste are stored and managed. And then the World Nuclear Association, which is kind of a world nuclear body of where things are at in the state of nuclear operations today. Projects big and small all over the world are tracked there. anybody's interested. So we look forward to the next time we can share information with you. We'll be doing a summary of this. We'll post the recording online, as well as all of the questions and answers. So thanks very much for participating. There was one more, I think, Darcy, that we wanted to talk about. If the CNSC, if Sarah's still on, somebody asked a really good question, and maybe that person is gone, but we'll capture it in the recording, about military personnel guarding nuclear power stations, security around power stations. If you would, can you touch on that?
Sure, thanks so much. So the CNSC, the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission, has requirements for ensuring that sites remain secure. So those requirements vary depending on what's on the site. So in Saskatchewan, for example, for uranium mines and mills in northern Saskatchewan, they have a security program to keep those sites secure. And in the same way, in same ways but different, nuclear power plants such as Ontario Power Generations or New Brunswick Power have full-time nuclear site security officers who ensure the security and safety of those facilities. So for small modular reactors, the expectation would be that there would be a site security plan, which would ensure that that facility was safe and secure throughout the entire operation. And so that's a requirement that we would have during the CNSC licensing process, where an applicant, whether it be SAS Power or whomever, would have to demonstrate the programs they have to hire those people, train those people, keep those people up to date with their skills and responsibilities, and then what kind of training programs and exercises they would conduct to ensure that the facility remains safe. So absolutely regulatory requirement, and there's lots of small rules that I'm not an expert in, but if we get to that stage, then we certainly can provide a bit more detail. Thanks.
And it's something that as a project that we're developing, we are then tasked with understanding all of those requirements and developing plans to fulfill the CNSC's objectives with the regulations. So it's the nuclear security aspect is definitely something that is new compared to what we're used to with our thermal operating power stations, and that's something we're developing right now.
Awesome. Dwayne, to answer your question, the recording isn't right now it won't be posted on saspower.com right now. There's a bit of work we have to do to get it postable, but I believe it'll either be on SAS Power or it'll be on our YouTube channel. I actually didn't ask that question of our digital team, so I'll find out and we'll definitely let you know when we send out our feedback package.
Yeah, transportation of waste materials. I just seen a question come in there. It would likely be by vehicle transport. We have a history in Canada of moving nuclear materials around the country, and so this would fall into those same requirements and legislation.
Thanks, Darcy. Oh, apparently there's a glitch with the survey, the feedback survey link. So somebody's working on that. So apologies for that. I thought somebody was talking about the survey, the polling that we had up. But we'll get that fixed. Awesome. So I think that brings us to a close tonight. We've gone a little bit over time. Appreciate anybody, people staying a little bit longer. We will take all of these questions in the chat and theme them out and provide a follow-up report. So Sarah and Paul and Ryan and Alex and Rick and Ryan, I think I got everybody, and Cameron. Thank you so very much for joining us tonight. Feel free, I know it's hours ahead in Ontario and New Brunswick, so thanks for staying later. Feel free to sign off. Thanks again for your help. Darcy and Ian, if you do have time, if you could stay for just a few more minutes, that would be awesome. But I understand you guys have busy schedules as well, and I know it's been long days for you. So somebody has their hand up. Sorry, go ahead. Go ahead. Sorry, Darcy.
Oh, I was just say I can stay for a few minutes. Yeah, no problem.
Somebody has their hand up, and I can't tell who it is.
Hi, Leanne. It's Tonya here.
Oh, hey, Tonya.
It's a Tanya Doms has her hand up. If you're able to
Oh.
type in the chat there, Tanya, we can probably get to your question.
Yeah. I just want to say I'm really appreciative of, you know, the people that have taken the time to join us tonight, who have just, you know, told us that maybe they're not supportive of SMRs, and that's okay, but to come and have a respectful dialogue about the future of power in Saskatchewan. With things going on in the world today, like I said earlier, it's sometimes hard to have those really clear conversations when you disagree. So I just want to thank people for being respectful. It gives us all a little more faith in humanity, I think, when we see people sharing their perspectives respectfully. Even if you don't agree, it's okay. Surface them and let's talk about it. Darcy and Ian, I think probably good to go.
Thanks, Leanne. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks so much, Darcy and Ian. I really appreciate it.
Right.
Safe
Thanks,
travels, everybody.
Right. Good night.
Tonya, you can go ahead and put the presentation down. Thanks. If you don't mind just staying on, I wouldn't mind doing just a quick check on a couple of the technical things, just to make sure that we've got the link working.